I'm joined now on the line from Washington, D.C. by Arise News correspondent Anieze Osakwe. Hello, Anieze. Thank you for being on the ground there. We've heard now from the EU joining China. We heard about China yesterday, and we had that conversation, Anieze. But today, the EU has now joined China to back Nigeria against the U.S. president. How should we be interpreting this comment, and what did the EU really say?
Absolutely. It's good to be with you as well, Adesuwa. And I think it's incredibly striking that this is an issue that began essentially as a local Nigerian problem, insecurity in the country, irrespective of religion, really. And over the weekend, we heard from President Trump. A few days later, we heard from China. And just yesterday, we heard from the EU ambassador to Nigeria and ECOWAS as well. His name is Mr. Gauthier Mignot. And, you know, I think that the fact that we're now hearing from all of these major economic world powers shows us just how important and critical this issue really is and has become. I think that, you know, this ambassador, the EU ambassador, when he was speaking during an interview in Lagos where he made these comments, he really emphasized the importance of peace. He emphasized the importance of dialogue and, you know, protecting human rights. And immediately, you can tell that the EU is essentially setting itself apart from the US. You know, President Trump's comments over the weekend were incredibly violent, you know, to say the least. He talked about the possibility of sending troops, military troops on the ground. He talked about the possibility of air raids to wipe out these Islamic terrorists and stop this Christian genocide. And of course, you know, designating Nigeria as a country of particular concern. But I think it's really important to note this diversion that the European Union seems to be taking from President Trump in telling Nigeria that it should maintain its sovereignty. Another really interesting point that the ambassador made was the fact that he's open to reintegrating ex-members of, you know, bandit groups or terror groups into society, you know, the possibility of peace talks. And it's interesting because this is something that we've covered extensively at Arise, bandit peace talks between community leaders in places like Katsina State. And those, to be honest, it's still somewhat ambiguous whether those led to any kind of diminishing of insecurity. But now that the EU has said that they're also open to these kinds of peace talks, and bringing people, you know, bringing these ex-terrorists back into society, it will be interesting to see if some sort of different outcome comes out of it. So a lot of key points from the EU ambassador, but the big point to take away is that they're looking for peace, really, in terms of, you know, improving Nigeria's insecurity.
Fingers crossed, Anieze. For some, it's the geopolitics playing out all over again, with EU, China standing with Nigeria against U.S. President Donald Trump. But let me ask you, is there any indication that diplomatic ties between Nigeria and Washington have been established ever since the weekend, since Donald Trump came up with all of his brouhaha?
So, you know, you and the package that just played right now was highlighting the comments made by the Minister of Information, Mohammed Idris. And he did have a line in his speech in Abuja where I want to quote it. He said that President Tinubu is taking the lead in addressing all areas of misunderstanding through diplomatic and political channels. So he didn't necessarily clarify which channels exactly he was referring to, but the fact that he said that, you know, President Tinubu is looking at a more diplomatic route, I think that seems to point to the fact that diplomatic conversations are taking place. I mean, it hasn't happened in the public realm. We had the Minister of Aviation, Festus Keyamo, write on Twitter just a couple of hours ago an open letter to President Trump, also denying these allegations of a Christian genocide in Nigeria. Like you said, we heard from Mohammed Idris, the Minister of Information, and also just yesterday, the White House had a press briefing. And the White House press secretary, her name is Caroline Leavitt, she basically reiterated all of President Trump's comments from Saturday. So that seems to point to the fact that any clear direction when it comes to diplomacy between Nigeria and the U.S. has not really moved forward since Saturday. The U.S. position still stands and Nigeria's position still stands as well. So we'll definitely be watching to see if anything concrete comes out of, these allegations, these lofty allegations that the U.S. has made against Nigeria.
Ted Cruz is doubling down. Now, he's talking about accountability. What more can you tell us about his plans?
Absolutely. So, within the last 24 hours, Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, put out this video on his X page. And he essentially said that he will be naming and shaming all of the Nigerian officials or government officials who he says are somewhat implicated in this Christian genocide that the U.S. has discussed. So, there isn't much clarity that has been provided as of now, but there has been some reporting that this could look like visa bans, this could be, freezing of assets. And I mentioned this earlier, but it really just made me think about how when Russia first invaded Ukraine, the UK and the US essentially put up something similar to all of the big Russian oligarchs. We had stories of them seizing mega yachts from, the waters of the Mediterranean, seizing luxury apartments in London, freezing bank accounts, offshore bank accounts, and also visa bans. We know that a lot of Nigerian government officials travel quite frequently to the US, to Europe, so that would be very significant if the US was to impose visa bans, because they think key members of this administration are enabling this, Christian genocide. So Ted Cruz has said that within the coming days and weeks, he will be putting out a list of people that the U.S. plans to target. So that's another thread that we will absolutely be watching. We'll see how all of this unfolds. It's changing by the day, but we'll keep our eyes on it for sure.
Thank you very much, Anieze, for keeping your finger on the pulse there for us in Washington, D.C. Anieze Osakwe is a Rise News correspondent in Washington, D.C.